You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fandom culture as a whole. For more information about the show and the other show that I do, 17 Karat K-Pop, visit 17karatkpop.weebly.com. You can also go to 17karatkpop.weebly.com /how to stan for more specific information about this podcast. Enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to How to Stan. This week on the show, all things boy bands with Maria Sherman, the author of Larger Than Life, A History of Boy Bands from New Kids on the Block to BTS. My first question for you is just, I'm curious how this book came about. Like, what drove you to decide that you wanted to make this book in the first place, and what was the process like of making it, putting it together and everything?
It's a little unusual, but I think this is what happened to me is sort of where the publishing industry is going a little bit. I've been writing professionally about music for, I guess, a decade now, which is a horrifying thing to admit, age-wise. And I started my career focusing on the sort of critically acclaimed rock and pop stuff that I think at that time period, most young journalists did. You sort of want to fit into the Rolling Stones of the world, I guess. And then on the side, I was the music director of my college radio station, listening to really weird, like Scandinavian noise, just really pretentious, like snobby stuff, which I still love and adore. And as the book says, have the embarrassing tattoos to back that up. But sort of a couple years into my career, One Direction happened, and I was not immune to their charms, and I was listening to them all the time.
I can definitely relate.
Yeah, and it became this thing where I was realizing that, like, okay, I am fanatical about this, so it's kind of hard to take a step back and really evaluate what's happening here. But I soon got over that. But then I sort of noticed that the way that they were being written about was like misogynistic to the level of, it reminded me of like how how rock critics used to write about like women rock performers in the 90s. It felt like very dated by decades and sort of unnecessarily derogatory towards young female music fans. And sort of when that became like the light turned on in my head, I was like, okay, I'm going to write about this stuff, and I'm going to write about it passionately and authoritatively. And until the sort of the gatekeepers of music press sort of take notice. And they did. And that's why I was able to write about it for, all the big publications. And then that eventually, after a few years of that leads to an email from the woman who became my book editor saying, hi, I'm from Black Dog and Leventhal, a Hachette imprint. I want to do a boy band book, and I think you're the one to write it. And it could be whatever you want. It's sort of unusual because normally you would write a book proposal and you'd get an agent and you would work very hard to like sell this book. But it kind of landed on my lap, which I'm very grateful for. And sometimes I think it makes me sound like a little bit of a brat, or I got really lucky. But then I have to think of like, I spent years writing about this music, and I think that eventually led to, people finding me and approaching me with the topic. It took about 2 years. I wish I would have had a lot more time because as you know from the book, it covers like 200 years of history.
Oh, yeah.
Very quickly. But it was stuff that I had already known and kind of fancied myself an expert at. So it's just more of like, how do I structure this thing and how do I cut the fat where I can? So I do think you could rewrite this book as like an encyclopedia series with each group getting their own entire book, so that was really stressful, but it was so fun. I always describe writing a book as being a totally torturous thing that I can't wait to do again. It's like misery, but it's so fun as well. And then there was like, I think I want to say like half a year, maybe longer, of going back and forth with the illustrator who was working in concert with me. I would say like, hey, I need a picture of Harry Styles' cheekbones on page whatever. And he would be like, got it, lady. And we would go back and forth. And then there was like dedicated time of laying out the book, which is not something I've ever had to do before. The sort of artistic element of laying it out is this beautiful object that people can have in their home and on their coffee tables. And then after that, it takes about a year for the book to come out. And that's the story. I apologize if it was too detailed.
No, that's interesting. I was curious because it seems like there really was a lot of detail and emphasis on drawings and stuff in there. So I was really curious how that, came about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's certainly a visual medium. I mean, I think more like music now more than ever is. It's not just something that you like go home and you put the record on your turntable or the CD into your CD player. You can listen to it while you're watching it on YouTube or whatever your medium is on your phone. So there was certainly like an element of that where I was kind of dead set on doing something sort of illustrative. And then of course my publisher specializes in this kind of book. And then it's just like, I don't know, you want to keep the fun, jovial energy of the boy band story alive. And what better way to do that than to draw them?
At the most basic level, how you define a boy band, and I mean, I've read the book, but for those who haven't, like, what is a boy band and how has that changed?
I begin by kind of giving a basic definition that I immediately unraveled. The sort of limited scope of how people perceive boy bands is because they think it's so formulaic, when really there's like an evolution that's really interesting. There's political progress involved with the process, and we could get all into all of that in a second. But essentially, a boy band is a group of young men. They're usually like either late teenage or in their early 20s. Some are like 13 and up, I would say, but 13 is kind of cutting it close. They are attractive. They sing well together. They dance well together. They look boyish, so that means like no facial hair. Tattoos come later in the boy band story, which is kind of indicative of another sort of evolution. Most of their songs are like ballads, or I take that back. They're centered on love or crushing, or sort of making the girl who is listening and who is their dominant fan demographic feel good about herself. Which I'm like, what's wrong with that? I'm trying to think of what the other sort of obvious ones are. They have great hair. They typically wear some sort of uniformed look. We sort of associate them with like a juvenile energy. They're often, the big one is of course that they're brought together by a impresario type. So there's a manager who finds the boys and puts them together. It's not like the garage band gets major label record deal of yesteryear. Everyone sort of loves that kind of story, and that's typically not the case with boy bands. They don't create themselves. So often they're made from reality television competitions, though that's not always the case. And often the person who's created them exploits them in some capacity. And we can, of course, get into that in a bit as well. So there is a sort of seedy Hollywood story lingering in this music that is so pleasant and so positive. So it's kind of a weird cognitive dissonance in the boy band story. It makes it a little bit more nuanced than most people think.
One of my previous episodes of the show, actually, I broke down kind of like media coverage of sports fanatics versus like boy band fanatics.
I love that.
Yeah, and so because the disparity was really something about like what was just like, oh, that's just how they act versus that's they're rabid fans, and all those characterizations. So I was just curious how you've seen, by putting together this book and stuff, what you've learned about that media coverage. Has it gotten any better, or do they still seem to be very like misogynistic, or just dismiss it as like this is just something only girls listen to, or things like that?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it's nice to have this conversation a couple months out from the book's release, because I've had time to talk to different press entities about it. And if you were to ask me this while I was writing the book, I would say, like, of course there's been some progress. I mean, the fact that this book exists in the world seems to show that, like, at least there's some interest in sort of validating and venerating the fangirl as a subject matter expert, instead of this sort of like hysterical, and I hate that word, it's so gendered, like maniacal, like bedwetting dummy or whatever it is. It's just all gross. People will, I think, are maybe quicker, and this is obviously like a hasty generalization, to not insult fangirls, which is typically what we're talking about when we're talking about boy bands. We're talking about their audience in certain capacities, but the overall feeling, I don't think, has changed much. I don't think there's been a lot of a cultural shift. People still diminish boy bands and their fans. I got that question so many times from some of the like bigger entities or like television shows or whatever, and they were like, well, why should we take boy bands seriously? And to me, it's kind of like, oh, I've been doing this for 15 years, it feels like. Yeah. Why is it like, and people obviously have been doing the work much longer than me. Why is this still how you would even phrase the question? So I think within like younger people certainly know better than to, like they can recognize the misogyny inherent sort of immediately in how we talk about boy bands, and music fans and people who I think are a little bit more like politically progressive can recognize that this is music that is being marginalized because of who is into it, which is young women and queer youth typically. um so I guess like cop out answer is yes and no. Yes, in some spaces, no, if you were just to go down the street and ask somebody their opinion on One Direction, you know?
There's more media literacy around just younger generations. Like they're not just at face value going
Mm-hmm.
to accept the description, and internalize like the description of a hysterical fan or whatever. Now we're more likely to call that out, but at the same time, the people writing that description are still writing it.
Yeah, exactly. And one frustration I've had, sort of looking back at how fangirls, especially boy band fangirls, are described is they're either used for two main reasons. One, to sort of validate the popularity of the group, because it's like if people are losing their crap or whatever the language is, clearly this is a big money making thing, and like that's interesting to some boring people, I guess. Or they're used as just like color for a bigger story. They're never given any sort of identity or any sort of like autonomy, which is frankly disappointing. And if they're not, if fans aren't, the people who are actually consuming this thing, then like how are boy bands ever supposed to be sort of accepted as something serious or like worthy of value?
Do you think a big part of this is the fact that it's specifically pop music we're talking about? Because I feel like the most viewed as real music, quote unquote, is like rock music. I just feel like pop itself is also a factor in how much a group is viewed as like deserving the amount of, attention they're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this movement in like music press coverage called poptimism in like the
Hmm.
last 7 years, which was basically the idea that like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have this knee jerk reaction to devalue pop music because it's created from this like large music industry machine. And I think there was a little bit of an overcorrection where people like kind of forgot how to be music critics. But I think like the nugget of the idea is pure and true and good. It just hasn't been instituted well. My thinking is, when traditionally, at least in the West, I should say, because I am an American, so I'm speaking from an American's perspective, the way in which we value music or consider it like canon worthy or like award winning is typically music that presents as authentic, and authenticity is defined by songwriting and often musical virtuosity. So that's playing an instrument, which is why rock music and like folk music and jazz music are considered some of the more serious genres or whatever.
So like the
Um,
garage band, boy band story you mentioned.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Boy bands don't typically do either, though. Of course, we've seen like BTS write some of their own songs, One Direction write some of their own songs, like in the '90s Y2K era, like Backstreet Boys write their own songs now, and things of that nature. But at the time, they didn't. So that was kind of a quick way to say, hey, this is meritless, and if they're not playing instruments on stage, then also this is meritless. But I think that's ridiculous because they're singing and dancing, which is a certain level of athleticism.
Hmm.
And yeah, there's so many other factors. I think the issue is definitely that it's pop music, and definitely that people still seem to approach pop music with their like rock music brain, or like what they think is like cool or worthy brain, and you can't do that. Like the times are changing.
I think pop sometimes gets this bad rep for being fluff stuff. Critics sometimes come down hard on a song that feels like it doesn't have substance, but like that has its own value too. If it makes you feel good, it's a good song, you know what I mean?
I agree with you 100%. You know, like at the end of the day, why do we like music? It releases dopamine in our brain. It literally makes us feel happy. If a boy
Hmm.
band song does that, and it does it to everybody, I don't care who you are, unless you've been indoctrinated by your environment, who doesn't love that? I think like also a lot of the sort of embarrassment that people may have if they like boy bands but don't want to talk about it or think they'll be read as uncool is often environmental and based on the fact that like people imagine boy band fans as like exclusively being children or like young women, which again, not a bad thing, but sometimes they don't want to be associated with. Maybe they feel like it's infantilizing. There are all these other things that it really bothers me. In the book, I do it in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek way. I say like the first sort of instance of fangirldom, it goes back to the 1800s with this Hungarian composer Franz Liszt, and this was this composer who was so talented, that he really inspired like a fervent female fan base because they just love the dude, which is why I think it's crazy to diminish something that's existed for 200 years. That's literal musical history. When you get into the 1900s, there's barbershop quartets, there's doo-wop, and then eventually in the 50s, you get Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, the Osmonds, and then it goes into Motown. But the 1950s are interesting because this is when boy bands, like, they're wearing the same outfits, they have similar haircuts, they're singing, but they're singing and they each have different vocal ranges, which I think it eventually evolves into different roles where a boy band is like, there's the heartthrob and the cute one and all of that. There's sort of an evolution, there. But the 1950s is also when you start seeing the American teenager as a demographic kind of form. And a lot of people, it's hard to believe that there was a time when we were alive where there wasn't a defined adolescence, but there wasn't, because there was war and all these horrible things. But in the 1950s, when we get the American teenager, they have money to spend. They're choosing to spend it on music. They're choosing to spend it on records, to go dancing with their friends. And that is when teenagers, specifically teenage girls, become sort of the arbiters of pop culture. Because now what becomes popular is what they spend their money on. Because adults aren't, like, they're interested, but they're not going to spend all their coin on like Beatles records or whatever in the 60s. So in the 60s and 70s is when you get the Beatles. A lot of people like to think the Beatles aren't a boy band. I like to think they both are and aren't. They sort of laid the foundation of what we see as the image of the screaming, crying fangirl. And you can just sort of watch any video of a live performance and you'll see exactly what I mean. The phrase is Beatlemania. Again, I have some qualms with, because mania is used to describe sort of a mental state. And often you'll find when people talk about fangirls, they pathologize them. They try to make it seem like a literal mental illness. So then in the 70s, this is when Motown is really popping off, and you get Motown being the pop music entity in Detroit, led by this guy, Berry Gordy, who creates a sort of factory system of getting singers together and writing songs for them and finding the best songwriters, essentially creating the machine that creates the first boy bands that we kind of see and see mimicked and throughout boy band history. And they were doing songs that were basically exactly like New Editions, but they were bigger. Why? Because they were white. And Berry Gordy, he's in Detroit, which is predominantly African-American city. A lot of his performers are black. His boy bands are black. And that seems kind of shocking if you consider the modern day boy bands, K-pop being the exception, where they were extremely white, because white music was seen as marketable, as sellable, as mainstream, essentially. Eventually, that sort of declines, music changes, and you get, in the late 70s, this group called New Edition from Boston. And New Edition is a young group of black boys. They're from the projects. They're performing Motown covers, so they're singing Jackson 5 songs. They're doing Sugar Pie, Honey Bunch. They're doing all those sort of classics. And I think that's kind of where the bulk of the book begins, in my opinion, is with New Edition. They sort of become the blueprint for all the boy bands that follow, the next big one being New Kids on the Block, who, they predate even me. But they were the first 80s boy band that was they were white boys, they were dancing, they weren't playing instruments on stage, they were singing, they were getting played on pop radio. They were all cute. They all kind of fit that blueprint that I laid out earlier. And this happens in all of pop music. I should explain it's not just boy bands, but because I wrote the book, I was like, I'm not going to ignore this history, because so much of the way that we think about pop music really limits and excuses any sort of racism, which is upsetting. And one more quick thing, and then I'll let you talk.
No, this is interesting. Keep going.
Okay, great. When I didn't put this in the book because it was sort of like a revelation I had after the fact, which I've talked to other people who've written books, and that apparently happens. It's kind of a bummer. I wish it could have been in the book. When we first get the word, or the phrase rather, boy band, it's not until the 80s. And that's with New Kids on the Block, because they become so popular. Everyone's like, what's the shorthand for this particular musical group that isn't playing instruments, but and the issue there is that since we're not even getting the terminology, the history that came before it gets erased, it gets muddled, because we need words and language to explain our history, right? The fact that boy band, the actual term, doesn't come along until New Kids on the Block kind of explains why all the pre 1980 whatever stuff is like hard to kind of unravel and unpack.
That was one of the things I most appreciated about this book, is because as I was reading it, it really did bring up the fact that so much pop music and boy band history like is owed to Black performers. I feel
Yeah.
like that is just, if you think about like the original boy bands, I think what might jump to a lot of people's minds right away is like a New Kids on the Block, or
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, someone from 80s or 90s. So that's interesting because I didn't know when that term was coined.
Yeah, and a lot of that too is well, this is obviously prior to the term boy band, but when we consider like a group of young Black men singing together, they're kind of written off as more mature simply because of race.
Hmm.
And the term boy band, obviously, it's supposed to orient as young, as pure, as virginal, whatever synonym you want to use, because boy is in the title, so you immediately think youth, childhood, something that's kind of asexual or budding sexuality. Which is not fair, because if you listen to New Edition, it sounds like especially early New Edition, they sound like the Jackson 5. It's incredibly innocent, jovial music. I mean, their first hit was called Candy Girl. There's nothing sexual about that. It is disheartening. And then of course, I mean, they are massively popular, and they just there was a BET series about them a couple of years ago that was fantastic. But it's really kind of interesting because, if you watch their behind the music, they're sort of like, why didn't this happen for us? The guy who made New Edition's career created New Kids on the Block. It's really shady.
Could you talk a little more about how Black bands helped create trends, for the ways that they really did pave the way, aside from just like the music, like just the different ways they have really shaped boy bands?
Yeah. I think it's funny because some of the songs, the sort of NSYNC and Backstreet Boys songs that live on into cultural memory, I Want It That Way, Bye Bye Bye, we hear them and we sort of divorce them from the time period a little bit. I think because like you hear them at the grocery store, you hear them at weddings. It doesn't really feel like the year 2000 in particular. But if you go back and you watch the videos and you read interviews with them, or you watch interviews with them, sometimes they speak with a little bit of a black accent, which is concerning. The fashion is very obviously hip hop influence. It's like Kangol hats, like LL Cool J, or like low rise pants and Timberland shoes, and all these things where it's like very clearly taken from hip hop, but it becomes fashionable because these very popular white boys are wearing it, or at least fashionable in the mainstream, I should say. But musically too, I think of like the golden era, if there were one, of boy band history, to be the late 90s, early 2000s, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, primarily because they inspired a lot of copycat acts. And so it's very easy to sort of see that as the pinnacle. And if you listen to their songs, so much of it sounds like they're trying to be like Boys to Men, a Philadelphia vocal group who I still struggle to call a boy band. I think because some of their songs were actually like a little bit more R than PG, and also they were just like sexier than, the like.
They were mature, yeah.
Yeah, it very much becomes this like appropriative thing, but we didn't have the language for that. Last year I wrote this thing for NPR about 10 years of NSYNC's, 20 years, excuse me, of NSYNC's No Strings Attached. One of the songwriters, who is this Swedish guy, because so much of this music, pop music rather, is written in Stockholm, was telling me that when they were writing for NSYNC, they wanted to do hip hop, R&B-esque music, but they wanted to sort of play it down, make it seem a little bit more like youthful or accessible. And I was listening to this guy and I was like, I think what you're trying to say is you just want to make it white. Like you want to find this thing and but not in so many terms. And obviously he's very talented, and, I feel like I'm giving him a bad rap, but like there was a language kind of used at the time period that sort of seemed like, okay, this thing works. We want to do that, but we want to make it a little bit more MTV than BET.
Right. They like characterize it as like, well, it's got to be palatable to these people.
Yeah, and I found myself like when I'm writing like the word mainstream a lot in earlier drafts, and I was like, I think what I'm trying to say is mainstream was equated with whiteness, as it often is still today, but extremely much then, which is kind of interesting. I do think after like some of the music obviously doesn't fall into that patterns, but the ballads are especially egregious. It really just sounds like Boys to Men. It's weird because it also kind of ebbs and flows, where genre appropriation, I guess we could call it as a shorthand, it goes away a little bit with One Direction and the Jonas Brothers because they're doing more of a pop rock thing. But then I think it comes back in K-pop in a really direct way.
I'm curious what your take is on just what you've observed over time and written about when it comes to fandoms created this sense of community or lack thereof, just because I feel like fandoms can be such a great place for inclusivity, but also the opposite. And
Mm-hmm.
just kind of have your observations been over time about just fandoms in general?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the main divide is like pre-internet and post-internet, right? Or like pre everybody being online all the time,
Yeah.
and today essentially. Where in the beginning, and I'm talking like New Kids on the Block beginning, but you could date it back further. Like the way that fandoms would communicate wasn't as much of like a giant community outside of live performance or other experiences like that, because you didn't have like an online forum in which to engage with people. So it's different because it was a little bit more of like I think a personal obsession. Certainly you would find your fellow fans in the fandom at school or at the concerts, but there was something a little bit more, I guess, IRL. And if it was all consuming, it's more you in your room buying all the stuff, listening to all the music, as opposed to maybe engaging online. Except, I guess that's the best way to put it. You're writing fan letters all day and getting to be familiar with whoever responds. Typically, a boy band parent, or if they're
Yeah.
big enough, a letter from the record label. So it's a little bit. There's more of a separation there, I would say. And then where you actually commune is in real life at the concert, whatever, etc. And then when you get to like the internet, and I'm talking actual Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, because we did have the internet, you get like AOL chat rooms, and fandoms sort of commune online in smaller doses, but you can certainly join fan clubs in a new sort of immediate way. And that's interesting too, because I think Backstreet Boys and NSYNC were like a dominant force in pop music, where I think boy bands typically have this feeling of being a little bit of an underdog interest, even though they're massively popular. But this was kind of like in your face, and the places you would commune were also live shows, but also like MTV's or Quest Live, where you could go to Times Square and watch the band wave at you from the windows, and you would know where they are based on the television, essentially MTV before the internet. And then when you get to One Direction, or I guess I kind of skipped the Jonas Brothers, but I think it's a similar thing. It's sort of like bubbling up. You're doing more online stuff. You're finding other ways to commune. You're, obsessing over them on TV or what have you at that time, Disney Channel. So it ages even a little bit down from MTV. But One Direction, I think, is where like there's a pivotal change. You see them grow from day one. You sort of see them on the X Factor, and they're little boys. And if you're early on in the fandom, this is like years of your life. You're really watching them kind of come together. And then when they do come together, they're using social media to their benefit. They're kind of doing what Justin Bieber did, which is giving the appearance of accessibility, which allows fans to interact with them, which allows fans to interact with each other. And then it sort of builds from there. And I think the key thing in this moment was that it was participatory as opposed to fully observed, right? So when you have like TV, or you're only interacting with the group that you love at a distance, you're not really engaging with them directly, though maybe it feels that way because you love them so much. With the internet, you can, and that changes things. And I think that also changes the like global nature of boy band fandom or fandoms in general, where they can interact with each other on an international basis, where opposed to like sending letters overseas, which I certainly did at some point, but but it becomes more massive and more participatory, and then you like build friendships online. They can influence the boy band that they love, and I don't mean entitlement in a negative way, just that they see that their boy bands are looking, and perhaps they can influence something about them. Maybe it's to get Harry Styles to be on board with queer rights and run around on stage with a rainbow flag. They can actually influence their boy band, so it's no longer that parasocial one-sided relationship in the same way that it used to be.
I was thinking it does seem like fandoms have like changed, because you probably are more likely to stay a fan longer term now, because you do feel that like sense of intimacy with them, even if it's just like through Twitter or whatever. I'm super biased, so I could just say what made One Direction, for example, be such a global sensation is because they're the best. I could just say the biased answer, but because certain boy bands kind of just come and go in a year or two, and then others are like One Direction big, and so that makes a lot of sense how the internet probably really helped
And also, boy bands are always like, I always joke that if you're into numerology, you can probably predict when the next boy band's going to hit, except for BTS kind of destroyed everything because they were just still so popular
Yeah.
for so many years. But that's also like a different story where you'll have a big boy band and it'll be massive for like 5 years, typically almost exactly 5 years. And then people get a little bit exhausted. It's also interesting because 5 years, that's like the length of like high school almost, and then like an extra year or middle school or whatever. So it's like a big chunk of time, especially when you're a young person where interests change. And then there's a period of like sort of exhaustion with the boy band thing. We don't want this anymore. We want something else. We want new genres. We want soloists. We're not interested in the boy band thing anymore. And then after a while, people are like, hey, remember boy bands? Like, that was fun. And a new one takes its place. So I think One Direction certainly benefited from kind of catching a lull, like, and sort of forming at a time where there wasn't a huge boy band. And there hadn't been for a couple of years. But also, there's the social media aspect of it. And I think there are just some certain things about them that, like, are kind of what you would call an it factor, I guess. They were cute. British boy bands had never really broken to that size in America before them, which is interesting. And that's kind of the confounding thing about it. Perhaps because the internet allowed us to see them all the time. I think they also were just intriguing because they really broke traditional boy band tropes in that
They didn't really
dance.
dance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone always brings up that they didn't dance, and that allowed them some delinquency. So there's something kind of like edgy about them, which I know some people are like, all right, go watch the What Makes You Beautiful video. But they are. There's something a little bit like,
Yeah.
they took the boyishness and they did it like in a Beatles-esque way where it was like playful and kind of like, ooh, I don't know what's gonna happen next. They were also performing music that was like diametrically opposed to what was on the radio at the time, which was like EDM pop stuff. Their touchstones were like classic rock, which is nuts.
Yeah.
Who would think that would work? And it worked so well. So there are a lot of like reasons in like the sort of boring marketing music business route, and then there are some that are just kind of like, they were great and interesting and people were ready for something new.
Yeah, right place, right time, somewhat.
Absolutely, yeah.
While you were talking about One Direction, I was thinking about like how in the book you talk about groups like Rainbow Direction, and I wonder if that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of, especially with One Direction, again, this is an example of a boy band that like are massive, undeniably. Like, you could go to Target and buy 30 items with their faces on it. However, they're not getting the same sort of attention as, like, I don't know, whatever is considered like cool pop music, right? So there's something that still feels a little bit underdog-esque about liking them, especially if you're like in junior high or high school and boys are like, that's stupid and gross. So there is something that feels a little bit alternative about liking the biggest boy band on the planet. As a fan, you sort of identify that immediately, right? Like, you can tell when someone's going to be down to talk about Four, and you can tell when someone has no idea what you're talking about. I think what you're doing is frivolous, which is often just, another way of people saying feminine, which is another example of sort of sexism in the boy band story. However, I think because you already sort of identify as somebody who likes something that is not considered cool, and you bond with other people who share this interest and they think it's cool, then there's more of an opportunity to sort of open up and be yourself, because it's like, we're already sharing this thing that for some reason is marginalized. Perhaps we can bolster each other up to be more confident in other aspects of ourselves that are marginalized or that we're scared of, or all these other things, which is also why I think, boy band fans would be very open with one another about like personal things in their lives, or like even mental illness, or any of these things. So the fact that it would sort of manifest in queer fans kind of opening up to one another is beautiful. And it's always happened, but it's like, I think it kind of exploded with One Direction, with these people finding each other online and then taking their fandom and using it as like real activism, like trying to help other queer youth who maybe feel like they're not being heard.
Fandoms can be such a big force, like, for good. And I'll be obviously more biased in this part of of the conversation than ever, but I have to talk about BTS changing the landscape of pop music, really. And so I know I may be just super biased to use hyperbole by saying that. You kind of talk about their impact.
Absolutely. I worked at Fuse, the television network, for many years. And one of my coworkers was actually a friend I had in college, this guy, Jeff Benjamin, who he's like one of the main, I guess, American K-pop guys. So I was watching music in South Korea early on, never thinking that it would break in the West for a few reasons. Historically, music that isn't recorded in English doesn't do well in America. That's why, like, in the 90s, there's this thing called like the Latin pop movement or Latin crossover, where you'd have artists like Shakira, Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez, Enrique Iglesias. Like, everybody was re-recording their Spanish language songs in English to get played on English language radio. Essentially, if you were anything other than an English speaking American, it was unlikely audiences would care. Obviously, Britain and Australia are examples, but primarily you had to be an American or like an Anglophonic speaker, I should say. With K-pop, I was like, this is fascinating. I could see this becoming like a very niche interest, but I never really saw it imploding the way that it did. When BTS breaks, I think there are a few reasons why it was them. 2017, when they're doing late night, though fans have obviously been listening to them much longer than that, they're kind of appearing after One Direction is broken up. So there's that lull I brought up. They are engaging on social media in an even more direct way. You are participating with them, and you're participating with them on an individual level with each member. And, K-pop had been an interest, and people were just sort of interested in South Korean culture in general at the time, in beauty and in fashion. There are all these other things, like CL was doing songs with Skrillex and Diplo. Big Bang was huge for a minute. So it was very much like all of these things where people were paying attention to South Korea. People wanted a boy band, sort of an interesting mix of like all of the elements kind of came together and brought us BTS. But as a boy band, which is another element of it that's so fascinating, they don't adhere to any of the traditional Western tropes. There is not the like defined role of cute one, heartthrob, bad boy, etc. They all have like fluid personalities. One guy can be the bad boy one day, another guy can be the soft one the next day. Their roles are kind of defined by what their performance, who's the lead vocalist, who's the dancer, who's the rapper. All these things are like very much different than traditional boy bands. And I also think it kind of validates their music critically a little bit more, because people are like, well, they're writing their own songs. There's like an inherent value there. But the fact that they blew up as big as they did in the West still blows my mind. Oh, I guess I should also add that they spent more time here and were sort of targeting a Western music market because K-pop was already so flooded in East Asia, especially South Korea. There's that element obviously has a role, but it's still like every day I'm like, I'm so happy you're here, but it's confounding as to how it happened.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because it does feel like there was, I think, also that like underdog element of them here. They had to pass out flyers for their free concert in LA. So to even know about them was very much in the early days felt like you were part of some sort of secret, or not secret fandom, but, very outside of the, quote unquote mainstream.
Yeah, and I think that's a really impactful feeling. There's a little bit of like an exclusivity to it, and then when you see them get huge, you're excited. Some people get like a little too precious about seeing their boy band blow up. So it's certainly something that like has an effect on your taste and how you feel about something. Yeah, they're just the best.
Yeah, they are. Given this whole evolution of boy bands and how a lot has changed, but a lot has also stayed the same, where do you see future generations of boy bands? What do you expect sonically or just, fashion-wise or trend-wise in terms of media coverage? Where do you see the future of boy bands going?
This is a question that is harder to like answer based on the sort of success of K-pop. I could say that my hope is that it'll become sort of a more international fascination. I mean, obviously boy band music is global, especially K-pop is global. But I mean, it would be so cool what if the next big boy band came from Argentina or something? Like, I like the idea of it being opened up so that, yes, America has the largest music market in the world, but that doesn't mean that our performers all have to come from 50 states or what have you. I think sonically, there will be a little bit more of like genre hybridity. And by that, I mean, it won't just be like mostly R&B or mostly pop rock oriented. I don't know. There's so many new rookie groups that I think will have a song that is an R&B ballad, and then the next one, a shoegaze indie rock song. So it's really sort of going to continue to go all over the place. It's basically just going to continue to grow and evolve with, I always say that a boy band reflects or chooses to try to reflect the interest of their fans and the interest of like the population at the time period. The fact that BTS is here makes sense because like younger listener, I mean, like, I guess I would say Gen Z, I'm a millennial, like listening and experiencing things from other cultures and and languages are way more open-minded than the people who came before them. So it makes sense that BTS would sort of blow up here. And I think as that train kind of continues, there's just going to be more and more innovation. Maybe we'll have a boy band where everybody's playing an instrument and not wearing similar fashions. And maybe we'll have a boy band that's body positive and they're not this sort of scrawny or lean or, like image that sometimes people have of boy band performers. I think really it's so open-ended. I would love to see a big boy band with a trans member. I think that seems like a natural progression of where we're heading.
Definitely, hopefully, just a more inclusive and broader definition of what it means to be a boy band.
Absolutely.
I do think BTS are kind of for this moment too, because it's like a time where people are a lot more people are receptive to what they're writing about, mental health and things like that. My final question for you was just, what's next for you? Would you ever write a follow-up book or any other writing in the works? And then where do you want my listeners to stay up to date with what you're writing, what you're working on?
I'm currently not working on a second book. That will happen at some point soon. It'll probably be another music book. Actually, you know what? It will be another music book. Most music books are still written by white men, and because I am neither of those things, I will continue to occupy this space. I'm hoping that I can maybe turn this into like a podcast or a documentary or something of that kind. So hopefully this book will evolve. But if anybody is curious to find my writing or my day-to-day stuff, they can always follow me on Twitter at Maria Sherm. And that's also Instagram. My website is mariasherm.com, which is my last name minus the AN. But yeah, big things are on the way. Nothing I can speak about right now, but I hope everybody, if you haven't picked up the book, you like it. And if you don't, write your own and then send it to me because I would love to read it.
Yeah, again, it's called Larger Than Life, A History of Boy Bands, from New Kids on the Block to BTS. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
No, I always say that for podcasts, long answers are the best. So
great. Yeah.
Awesome.